8,376 meters. That is how far down the cameras had to go. And when the footage finally came back up, the scientists watching it went completely silent. Not because it was beautiful, because it was something they had never prepared themselves to see. Because every model, every prediction, every assumption they had built their careers on was sitting there on the screen, being quietly destroyed by creatures that had never once seen sunlight. This is the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean. A geological scar sitting less than 100 kilometers from Puerto Rico, home to 3 million people. And until very recently, nobody had ever put a camera inside it. Not properly, not deep enough, to see what was actually living down there, what the walls actually looked like, what the geology was actually doing. For most of human history, it sat in complete darkness and complete scientific ignorance, while the whole world talked about the Mariana Trench on the other side of the planet. And when the cameras finally went in, everything changed. I want you to stay with me for this entire video because what I am about to walk you through is not just a story about deep sea creatures, as incredible as those creatures are. This is a story about a geological threat sitting quietly beneath one of the most populated regions in the Americas, a tsunami risk that scientists are actively debating right now, a biological world that operates on rules so different from everything above it that the researchers who discovered it had to rewrite the textbooks they had spent decades writing, and a warning about how little we actually know about the planet we think we understand completely. Let us start with what this place actually is. The Puerto Rico Trench sits at the boundary between two of the Earth's tectonic plates, the North American plate and the Caribbean plate. These two plates have been grinding against each other for millions of years. The North American plate is pushing westward and downward, sliding underneath the Caribbean plate in a process called subduction, moving at roughly 2 centimeters per year. That sounds like nothing, 2 centimeters. You could measure that with a ruler. But 2 centimeters per year, sustained over millions of years, with the full mass of a continental plate behind it, builds stress on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. And the result of all that stress, all that geological pressure, all that tectonic force, is a trench that runs approximately 800 kilometers from east to west across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. 800 kilometers. For context, that is roughly the distance from New York City to Chicago. One continuous geological feature hidden beneath the ocean that almost nobody has ever heard of. At its deepest point, a location called the Milwaukee Deep, the seafloor sits 8,376 meters below the surface. I need you to really sit with that number because it is easy to hear a large number and let your brain just file it away as very deep and move on. So let me give you a comparison that I think will actually land. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, stands 8,149 meters above sea level. If you took Mount Everest, turned it completely upside down, and dropped it into the Milwaukee Deep, the tip of what used to be the summit would be sitting more than 400 meters underwater. 400 meters of ocean water above the peak of the tallest mountain in the world. That is what 8,376 meters of depth actually means. That is the scale of what the cameras were sent into. Now here's the thing that makes this even more remarkable. This is not sitting in some remote, unpopulated corner of the planet. The Mariana Trench, which everyone talks about, is in the Western Pacific, thousands of kilometers from any major population center. The Puerto Rico Trench is sitting less than 100 kilometers from an island with 3 million people living on it. It is surrounded by some of the most densely populated islands in the Caribbean. Hispaniola is nearby, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Antigua, Martinique. Millions of people living their daily lives on the geological rim of something they almost certainly do not know exists. And the cameras were about to show exactly why that matters. Before we get into what the footage revealed, I need to explain the engineering problem that kept cameras out of this place for so long. Because this is not just about not having looked. Getting a camera to 8,176 meters is one of the most technically demanding things human beings have ever attempted. Pressure in the ocean increases by approximately 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. At the surface, you are experiencing 1 atmosphere, the weight of all that air above you pressing down. At 10 meters underwater, 2 atmospheres. At 100 meters, 11 atmospheres. At 8,300 meters, you are looking at approximately 830 atmospheres, pressing in from every single direction simultaneously. Every square centimeter of surface area on anything you send down there is experiencing a force equivalent to roughly 8 tons pushing against it. Not pounds, tons per square centimeter. Think about what that means for engineering. Any airspace, any gap, any hollow section in a vehicle sent to those depths will be crushed instantly and completely. You are not designing something that needs to be strong in certain places. You're designing something that cannot have a single weakness anywhere across its entire structure. One failed seal at 8,000 meters does not mean a slow leak. It means the vehicle ceases to exist as a functional object in a fraction of a second. And there is no rescue. There is no repair operation. There is no going down to retrieve it. There is just the pressure, and then there is not. This is why almost no research vehicles on Earth can reach the Puerto Rico Trench. Standard scientific remotely operated vehicles, the workhorses of deep sea research that scientists use for most ocean exploration, are typically rated to depths of 3,000 to 6,000 meters. That covers the vast majority of the ocean floor. It does not cover what is called the hadal-zone, the deepest portions of ocean trenches. The zone that begins at around 6,000 meters and goes all the way to the absolute bottom of the deepest points on Earth. The hadal-zone is less than 2% of the ocean floor by area, but it is the least explored, least understood, most extreme environment on the planet. And reaching it requires technology that is extraordinarily rare. The vehicles that can reach the Milwaukee Deep can be counted on one hand with fingers to spare. That is not an exaggeration. That is the actual state of deep sea research infrastructure in the 21st century. We live in an era when private companies are launching rockets into orbit on a regular schedule, when we have rovers driving around the surface of Mars, sending back high-definition video, and we have fewer than a handful of vehicles capable of reaching the deepest trench in the Atlantic Ocean that sits next to American territory. Something about those two facts, sitting next to each other, should make you very uncomfortable. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has been the primary American institution conducting research in the Puerto Rico Trench region. Their exploration program, operating from a research vessel called the Okeanos Explorer, has conducted multiple expeditions using a deep-rated, remotely operated vehicle called Deep Discoverer, capable of reaching 6,000 meters. That covers a significant portion of the trench, but not the very deepest sections. And even with that limitation, what the cameras brought back was enough to fundamentally change what scientists thought they knew. Let us start with the geology, because what the cameras found on the trench walls was not what anyone expected. And it matters in ways that go well beyond academic interest. The trench was expected to look like a trench. A deep groove in the seafloor, steep walls, flat bottom, relatively simple structure. What the cameras actually showed was a landscape of almost incomprehensible geological complexity. Steep escarpments dropping hundreds of meters in a single continuous face. Terrace formations on the walls where ancient landslides had left behind step structures, like a geological staircase built by catastrophe. Sediment flows that had cascaded from shallow water all the way down to the deepest sections of the trench, carrying material from near the surface down to 8 kilometers below, leaving trails that the cameras could follow across the seafloor like geological crime scenes. The trench is not a groove, it is a canyon system. An 800-kilometer canyon system of geological complexity that had never been properly mapped, never been properly understood, and in large sections, never been seen by any camera at all before these expeditions. And then the cameras found the landslide evidence. This is the part where the geology stops being just academically interesting and starts being something that affects millions of living people. Because what the cameras documented on the walls of the Puerto Rico Trench was evidence of massive underwater landslides, not small geological slumps, not gradual sediment movement, mass failure events where entire sections of the trench wall had given way completely and collapsed downward, leaving behind scarps and debris fields and destabilized remaining wall sections that are visible in the footage like open wounds in the geological record. The scale of some of these ancient slide deposits is almost impossible to convey in words. Individual landslide events appear to have moved volumes of material measured in cubic kilometers. The debris fields they left behind extend across the trench floor for distances that require the camera system to traverse them for hours of continuous filming. We are talking about geological events so large that their aftermath is still clearly visible on the seafloor, preserved in the cold dark for tens of thousands of years. And then the cameras found something that changed the conversation from historical geological record to active present-day concern. Sections of the trench wall that have not yet failed, material that is visibly fractured, tilted, undercut by geological processes, sitting in configurations that make geologists deeply uncomfortable because those configurations suggest that what is holding them in place is not structural integrity. It is friction. It is geological circumstance. And geological circumstance, given enough time and the right trigger, is not a permanent solution. There is historical evidence of this risk in the Caribbean specifically. In 1918, an earthquake in the Mona Passage, west of the Puerto Rico Trench, generated a tsunami that killed more than 100 people on Puerto Rico's northwestern coast. That event, as devastating as it was, originated in a relatively smaller geological feature than the main trench system and produced a tsunami that was limited in scale compared to what a major landslide event on the trench walls could theoretically generate. The camera footage has not reduced this risk assessment. By documenting the extent of unstable geology in specific detail, in many ways it has made the risk picture more complex and more alarming than it was before the cameras went in. Scientists who study the region are having conversations about preparation, about warning systems, about public awareness, conversations that have not yet adequately reached the public in Puerto Rico or across the northeastern Caribbean. Now let us talk about the biology, because after everything I have just told you about the geology, you might think that is the most remarkable part of this story. You would be wrong. When the cameras went down into the biological darkness of the Puerto Rico Trench, researchers had predictions. They were not flying completely blind. Decades of research in other deep trenches, particularly the Mariana Trench and the Kermadec Trench in the Pacific, had built models for what hadal biological communities should look like, what organisms should be present, what their adaptations should be, what the ecological structure of an extreme deep trench environment should resemble. Those models turned out to be partially correct and substantially wrong in ways that the researchers who had spent careers building them described in their published papers, using words like unprecedented and unexpected. These are deep sea scientists, people who chose a career in one of the most specialized, difficult, and funding-starved fields in biology. They are not prone to hyperbole. When they write unprecedented in a peer-reviewed paper, they mean it. Let us start with the snailfish. If you have never heard of snailfish, your understanding of life on Earth is about to expand in a direction you did not expect. The family Liparidae, to use their scientific name, are small translucent fish that look, if you are being completely honest about it, like someone tried to make a fish out of wet tissue paper and left it slightly unfinished. They are gelatinous. They are pale. They look fragile in a way that seems almost comically incompatible with the most extreme environment on the planet. They are also the deepest living vertebrates ever recorded on Earth. Snailfish have been documented in the Puerto Rico Trench at depths that place them among the deepest fish ever filmed anywhere on Earth. And what makes them biologically extraordinary is not just where they live, but how they survive there. Their bodies have no significant air spaces. Where most fish use a swim bladder filled with gas to control buoyancy, snailfish have no such structure. Crushing it at 8,000 meters would be instant death. Instead, their bodies are highly flexible, highly pliable, adapted to exist in an environment where the pressure that would kill almost any other vertebrate animal is simply the normal condition of existence. At the cellular level, snailfish use molecules called piezolites, chemical compounds that stabilize proteins and prevent them from being deformed by the crushing pressure of the water above. Their biochemistry has been specifically modified by millions of years of evolution to function correctly in conditions that would denature and destroy the proteins of almost any other animal on Earth. They are not just surviving in the deep trench, they have evolved to belong there. And seeing them on camera, moving actively, feeding, behaving like normal fish, doing normal fish things at 8,000 meters below the surface, is one of the most disorienting things you can watch, as someone who thinks they understand how biology works. Amphipods are crustaceans, relatives of shrimp and crabs. In shallow coastal waters, amphipods are typically a few millimeters long, small enough that you would not notice one unless you were specifically looking. In the hadal-zone of the Puerto Rico Trench, the pressure and the specific ecological conditions of the deep environment produce something called deep-sea gigantism, a phenomenon where organisms that are tiny in shallow water grow to dramatically larger sizes in the extreme deep. And the amphipods documented by cameras in the Puerto Rico Trench are not a few millimeters long. They are several centimeters, some approaching 10 centimeters, and they appear not as isolated individuals, but in extraordinary numbers. Baited camera systems dropped to the trench floor. Landers carrying food as bait to attract organisms for filming are sometimes completely covered within hours of landing on the sediment. Completely covered. The footage shows what looks like a slow-motion frenzy. Hundreds of large, pale crustaceans arriving from the edges of the frame, converging on any available food source with an efficiency and a collective organization that makes it immediately clear these organisms are extraordinarily well adapted to their specific ecological role. There is something genuinely unsettling about watching this footage. The camera lands on the sediment. For a moment, there is nothing, just flat gray seafloor, the occasional particle of marine snow drifting past the lens, the absolute stillness of an environment that has never once experienced daylight. And then from the edges of the frame, they start arriving. First a few, then more. Then enough that the camera is essentially documenting a carpet of pale, moving bodies covering every surface. It is one of the most alien things that has ever been filmed on this planet. The cameras also documented xenophores. These are organisms that challenge the basic biological intuitions most people carry around. A xenophore is a single cell, one cell, an organism with no brain, no nervous system, no organs in any conventional sense, and some of them reach sizes of up to 20 centimeters across. 20 centimeters, a single cell you could hold in your hand. They are technically protists, distantly related to amoebas, but they build complex protective structures from the sediment particles around them, essentially constructing tiny architectural shells for themselves out of whatever the deep sea floor has available. They were found in unexpected abundance and variety in the Puerto Rico Trench footage, which tells scientists something important about the sediment chemistry and the biological productivity of that specific environment. There were holothurians, sea cucumbers, moving slowly across the sediment in footage that at first glance looks completely still because they move so slowly. But they are moving, feeding, processing sediment, playing their specific role in an ecosystem that runs on energy budgets and timescales that bear almost no resemblance to anything in the sunlit world above. There were polychaete worms in the sediment, glass sponges anchored to the harder substrate of the trench walls, organisms using the chemical energy from fluid seeps, locations where water and gases emerge from tectonic fractures in the seafloor to power entire communities that have no relationship whatsoever with sunlight. Chemosynthetic ecosystems, life that runs not on photosynthesis but on chemistry, deriving energy from the geological processes of the planet itself rather than from the star it orbits. These seep communities were documented on the Puerto Rico Trench walls in locations that had not been previously known, adding a completely new chapter to what scientists understood about life in the Atlantic hadal-zone. What the cameras revealed was not a dead zone, not a cold, quiet abyss where very little happens very slowly. What they revealed was a structured, functioning ecosystem operating on its own terms, by its own rules, with its own dynamics, in an environment that has been completely isolated from the sunlit world above for geological timescales. An entire biosphere that has been sitting in the darkness less than 100 kilometers from millions of human beings, completely unknown, completely unstudied for the entire history of human civilization. And here is the number that should stop you completely. The percentage of the Puerto Rico Trench floor that has been imaged by camera systems in sufficient resolution to conduct biological or geological survey is approximately 2 to 3%. 2 to 3%. The trench is 800 kilometers long. The deepest sections, the actual hadal-zone, represent an area of seafloor that has been almost entirely in complete darkness, not just metaphorically, but in terms of scientific observation. Every discovery I have described to you in this video, the snailfish, the amphipods, the xenophores, the unstable landslide deposits, the fluid seeps, the fracture systems, all of it comes from a tiny fraction of the actual environment. A sample so small that drawing broad conclusions from it is the kind of scientific risk that makes careful researchers deeply uncomfortable. What does the other 97 to 98% look like? What organisms live in the sections that have never been filmed? What geological features exist in the eastern portions of the trench near its junction with the mid-Atlantic ridge system, sections that have essentially never been investigated by any camera system? What chemosynthetic communities are producing biological signatures in the water column data, signatures that suggest something significant is happening at specific locations on the trench floor, but where no camera has ever gone to see what it is? We do not know. We have the water column chemistry saying something is there. We do not have the footage. The technology to answer these questions is improving. Full ocean depth landers, unmanned vehicles designed to sink to the bottom, collect data and footage, and float back up, have become more capable over the past decade. Acoustic mapping systems on surface vessels have reached resolutions that allow detailed topographic maps of trench floors to be built without sending a camera anywhere, maps that then guide subsequent camera deployments with far greater precision. New baited camera systems can operate at trench depths for extended periods, returning footage that captures not just what is there, but how biological activity changes over hours and days, temporal data that single dive snapshots cannot provide. The next generation of discoveries from the Puerto Rico Trench is coming. The researchers planning future expeditions have identified specific targets based on what the early footage suggested but could not confirm. Sections of wall where the seep signatures are strongest. Regions of the deepest axial valley where sediment characteristics visible in limited footage suggest biological communities different from those already documented. Geological structures that appear on acoustic maps but have never been directly observed. The question is funding, ship time, vehicle access, international collaboration between the American, Caribbean, and European research programs that all have stakes in understanding this feature but have historically worked in relative isolation from each other. The answer, if current research funding trajectories hold, is that the comprehensive survey the Puerto Rico Trench deserves is still years away from beginning. And that matters, because this is not just a scientific question about what fascinating organisms live in an inaccessible corner of the ocean. This is a question with direct implications for the safety of millions of people living on the geological rim of a feature that is actively, presently, geologically unstable. The cameras going into the Puerto Rico Trench have started closing a gap between what exists and what we know about it, a gap that is honestly embarrassing when you lay it out plainly. The deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, an active geological boundary between tectonic plates, a potential tsunami source sitting next to American territory, a biological ecosystem representing some of the most extreme life on Earth, and until the last decade or so, functionally unknown. That gap should not have existed. It exists because of funding priorities and research infrastructure and the way scientific attention tends to follow existing scientific prestige rather than actual importance. The Mariana Trench gets the documentaries, and the James Cameron submersibles because it is the deepest point in the ocean. And being the deepest is a compelling headline. The Puerto Rico Trench gets a fraction of that attention because being the second deepest, even when second deepest is more strategically located, more geologically active, and more directly relevant to human populations, is not a compelling headline in the competition for scientific budgets. Importance and attention are not the same thing. They are not even reliably correlated. But here is what I want to leave you with. Because this story is not ultimately about what the cameras found, as extraordinary as that footage is. It is about what the cameras have not found yet. What is sitting in the dark in the other 97% of an 800-kilometer trench at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. What organisms have developed in complete isolation from the sunlit world above for millions of years in the sections of the trench that no camera has ever visited. What geological processes are active on sections of wall that have never been observed. What the complete picture of the tsunami risk actually looks like when we have data from the full feature rather than a small fraction of it. The Milwaukee Deep is 8,176 meters below the surface of the Caribbean Sea. It is dark. It is cold. It is under a pressure of 830 atmospheres that would destroy almost any piece of technology we could build without years of specialized engineering. It contains life that has never seen light, operating on chemistry and geological energy, adapted over millions of years to conditions that would kill every other vertebrate on Earth instantly. It sits beneath fractured geology that holds direct implications for populated coastlines across the Atlantic Basin. And we have seen 2 to 3% of it. The rest is still down there, in the dark, at 830 atmospheres, patient in the way that only things that have existed since before human beings stood upright can be patient. The cameras will go back. They always do, eventually, when the funding comes through and the ship time is secured and the vehicle is prepared and the 1,000 logistics of deep sea research are aligned correctly. And based on what they have already shown us, what they find when they go back is going to require scientists to substantially revise what they think they know. Again, the way the first footage required revisions. The way every time cameras have entered the deepest places on Earth, the world has turned out to be more complex, more alive, more surprising than the models predicted. We named it the Milwaukee Deep in 1939 because the ship that first measured its depth was named Milwaukee. We filmed a fraction of it decades later. We found creatures that rewrote deep sea biology, a geology that rewrote Atlantic tectonic risk assessment, and evidence of an ecosystem so complete and so alien that the scientists who discovered it are still processing what they saw. We still do not know what is at the bottom of it. That should be more unsettling than it is, and it should make the next expedition feel a great deal more urgent than the current funding situation suggests anyone believes it to be. The ocean covers 71% of the Earth's surface. The hadal-zone, the deepest trenches where the most extreme conditions exist and the most extreme life has developed, covers less than 2% of that ocean floor. We have looked at a fraction of the most extreme part of the planet. And every single time we send cameras into those depths, we find something that nobody predicted. The question is not whether the Puerto Rico Trench holds more discoveries. It does. The question is whether we decide that knowing our own planet is a priority worth investing in before the geology decides to make that question academic in a way that nobody living on the rim of the trench will appreciate. 8,376 meters down, something is waiting to be discovered. It has been waiting for the entire history of human civilization. It will keep waiting, patient and dark and extraordinary, until the cameras go back. And when they do, nothing will be the same.